Long before the United States became a nation, 13 British colonies stretched along the eastern coast of North America. They were separated by forests, rivers, and mountains, yet they shared one powerful connection. They all lived under the rule of the British Crown. Life in the colonies was difficult but hopeful. Farmers cultivated the land, merchants traded with Europe, and families dreamed of building better lives. Small towns slowly grew into busy ports, especially cities like Boston, where trade brought both opportunity and conflict. After the costly Seven Years' War, Britain faced enormous debt. To recover financially, Parliament introduced a series of new taxes on the American colonies. Colonists were forced to pay for paper, newspapers, legal documents, glass, paint, and eventually even tea. The colonists believed these taxes were deeply unfair. They had no representatives in the British Parliament, yet they were expected to obey every new law. A simple phrase began spreading from town to town. No taxation without representation. What started as frustration soon became resistance. British customs officers increased inspections. Redcoat soldiers patrolled the streets of Boston. The presence of armed troops reminded every colonist that Britain intended to maintain complete control. Inside taverns and meeting houses, local leaders gathered in secret. Merchants, lawyers, farmers, and craftsmen quietly discussed the future of their colonies. They knew that speaking openly against the crown could be considered treason. Groups such as the Sons of Liberty organized protests, distributed pamphlets, and encouraged ordinary citizens to stand together. Across the colonies, more people began believing that freedom might only be possible if they resisted British rule. Meanwhile, Britain responded by sending even more soldiers and supplies across the Atlantic. Massive warships entered Boston Harbor, carrying thousands of experienced troops. Their arrival made one thing clear: the conflict was no longer political. It was becoming military. Throughout the countryside, ordinary farmers left their fields to train with local militias. Most had little military experience, but they were determined to defend their homes and their rights. They became known as the Minutemen, citizen soldiers prepared to fight at a minute's notice. Then, on the morning of April 19th, 1775, everything changed. In the quiet village of Lexington, a small group of colonial militia stood waiting on the village green. Facing them was a disciplined force of British redcoats marching toward the town. Neither side truly wanted to fire the first shot, but within moments a single gunshot echoed across the field. No one knows with certainty who fired first, yet that single shot would forever be remembered as the shot heard around the world. Musket fire erupted through the smoke. Several colonial militiamen fell where they stood. The British continued toward Concord, believing the rebellion would quickly collapse. Instead, the opposite happened. At Concord's North Bridge, colonial militia regrouped and fought back. As British troops began their long march toward Boston, American fighters attacked from behind stone walls, forests, and farmhouses along the road. For nearly 20 miles, the retreat became a running battle. By the time the exhausted British Army finally reached Boston, hundreds of casualties had been suffered on both sides. The American Revolution had officially begun. There would be no easy return to peace. A war for independence had started, one that would forever change the course of history. As British soldiers fought their way back to Boston, thousands of colonial militia surrounded the city from every direction. The roads were blocked. The countryside was no longer safe. Boston had become a city under siege. The fighting at Lexington and Concord had transformed scattered acts of resistance into a full-scale war. But the colonies faced a serious problem. They had brave volunteers, yet they lacked a unified army. In June of 1775, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia to decide the future of the rebellion. Their most important decision was choosing a commander who could unite the colonies. Their choice was George Washington of Virginia. Tall, disciplined, and respected for his military experience during the French and Indian War, Washington accepted command knowing the task before him would be one of the greatest challenges in history. When he arrived outside Boston, what he found was not a professional army. It was a collection of ordinary people: farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, teachers, men from different colonies who spoke with different accents, carried different weapons, and followed different traditions. Washington immediately began turning these volunteers into soldiers. Training became stricter. Discipline became essential. Every musket had to be cleaned. Every formation had to be practiced. Every soldier had to believe that victory was possible. Still, one problem remained. The Continental Army had very little gunpowder, very few cannons, and almost no military supplies. Across the battlefield, British forces continued strengthening their defenses around Boston. More soldiers arrived. Cannons protected the harbor. Royal Navy warships controlled the coastline. It seemed almost impossible that the Americans could force such a powerful army to leave. Then came one of the bloodiest battles of the early Revolution. On June 17, 1775, thousands of British redcoats marched uphill toward colonial positions at Breed's Hill during what became known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. The American defenders waited patiently behind their earthworks. Every shot mattered. Gunpowder was scarce. The British advanced once. They were driven back. They advanced a second time. Again, they suffered terrible losses. Only after a third assault, when the Americans had nearly exhausted their ammunition, were the British able to capture the position. Technically, Britain had won the battle, but the cost was shocking. More than 1,000 British soldiers had been killed or wounded in just a few hours. The message was clear. This would not be a quick victory. The colonies were prepared to fight. Washington understood that defeating Britain would require patience as much as courage. Instead of launching reckless attacks, he focused on strengthening his army while searching for a way to break Britain's control of Boston. That opportunity came through an extraordinary mission. Colonel Henry Knox proposed transporting dozens of heavy cannons from Fort Ticonderoga, nearly 300 miles away. During one of the coldest winters in memory, Knox and his men dragged enormous artillery pieces across frozen rivers, snow-covered mountains, and dense forests using sleds pulled by oxen. Many believed it could never be done. Yet after weeks of relentless effort, the cannons finally reached Washington's army. Under the cover of darkness, American soldiers hauled the massive guns onto Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston Harbor. When the sun rose, British commanders looked up in disbelief. Powerful American cannons now dominated both the city and the Royal Navy below. General William Howe immediately understood the danger. If he stayed, Boston could be destroyed. If he attacked, his army might suffer another disaster like Bunker Hill. There was only one realistic choice. On March 17, 1776, thousands of British soldiers boarded their ships and sailed away from Boston. For the first time since the war had begun, the Continental Army had achieved a major strategic victory. The city was free. But Washington knew the hardest battles were still ahead. Britain had not surrendered. It was preparing an even larger invasion. The war for American independence was only beginning. Boston had been liberated, but no one believed the war was over. Across the Atlantic, King George III refused to accept the growing rebellion. To him, the colonies were not fighting for freedom. They were committing treason against the British crown. While George Washington strengthened the Continental Army, another battle was unfolding hundreds of miles away inside Independence Hall in Philadelphia. The delegates of the Second Continental Congress faced a difficult question. Should they continue asking Britain for peace? Or should they declare complete independence? For weeks, passionate debates filled the chamber. Some feared independence would bring endless war. Others believed there was no turning back. Among them was a young Virginia delegate named Thomas Jefferson. Quiet, thoughtful, and gifted with words, Jefferson was chosen to draft a document unlike anything the world had ever seen. Working late into the night by candlelight, he carefully wrote the principles that would define a new nation. He declared that all people are created equal, that every individual possesses certain unalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those words would echo through history for centuries. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress officially approved the Declaration of Independence. For the first time, the 13 colonies no longer saw themselves as British possessions. They declared themselves the United States of America. News spread quickly through the colonies. In Philadelphia, crowds gathered outside Independence Hall as the Declaration was read aloud. Church bells rang across the city. People embraced one another. Some celebrated with tears in their eyes, believing they had witnessed the birth of a new nation. In New York, an angry crowd pulled down a statue of King George III, melting its lead into musket balls for the Continental Army. The revolution had entered a new stage. There would be no compromise, no return to British rule. When news reached London, King George III was furious. Britain responded with overwhelming force. An enormous fleet crossed the Atlantic, carrying tens of thousands of British soldiers, along with experienced German Hessian troops hired to crush the rebellion once and for all. It was one of the largest military expeditions ever sent across the ocean. As the fleet entered New York Harbor, the horizon seemed covered with ships. From nearby hills, George Washington watched silently. He understood exactly what stood before him. His army was smaller, poorly equipped, and far less experienced. Yet retreat was not an option. Washington ordered his men to dig defensive positions around New York. Cannons were placed along strategic hills. Earthworks stretched across the landscape. Every soldier prepared for what many believed would be the decisive battle of the Revolution. In August 1776, British forces launched their attack during the Battle of Long Island. The Continental Army fought bravely, but British numbers, training, and battlefield tactics proved overwhelming. Washington watched as his lines slowly collapsed under relentless pressure. For a moment, it appeared the revolution itself might end before it had truly begun. With British forces closing in from every direction, Washington faced an impossible decision. Fight to the last man, or save the army for another day. That single decision would determine whether the dream of American independence survived or disappeared forever. Under the cover of darkness, George Washington made one of the boldest decisions of the entire war. With British forces closing in from every direction, the Continental Army faced complete destruction. If they were trapped in Brooklyn, the revolution would almost certainly come to an end. Then nature offered an unexpected chance. A thick fog rolled across the East River. Hidden by the darkness and the mist, Washington ordered thousands of exhausted soldiers to quietly board small wooden boats. Throughout the night, they crossed the river in complete silence. Not a single soldier was left behind. When the sun finally rose, the British looked across the river in disbelief. The American army had vanished. It was a miraculous escape that preserved the revolution, but survival alone would never win the war. As winter approached, the Continental Army continued retreating through New Jersey. Many soldiers were hungry. Many had no proper shoes. Some wrapped pieces of cloth around their feet to march through the frozen roads. Even worse, enlistments were about to expire. If nothing changed, Washington's army would simply disappear. He needed a victory. Not next year, not next month. Immediately. On the freezing night of December 25th, 1776, Washington gathered his men along the icy banks of the Delaware River. Snow fell heavily. The wind cut through their uniforms. Large blocks of ice floated past the boats. Despite the terrible weather, the army began crossing the river before dawn. Every soldier understood the risk. If they failed, the revolution might die that very morning. Hours later, the exhausted Americans reached the town of Trenton. The Hessian garrison never expected an attack during a winter storm. Washington's surprise assault was swift and overwhelming. Within hours, the town was captured. Hundreds of enemy soldiers surrendered. For the first time in months, the Continental Army had achieved a decisive victory. Hope returned. Only days later, Washington struck again at Princeton. Another unexpected victory shocked the British command and inspired thousands of new volunteers to join the cause. The revolution was alive once more. Still, Britain remained one of the most powerful empires on Earth. Washington understood that America could not defeat Britain alone. Across the Atlantic, Benjamin Franklin worked tirelessly in France to gain support for the American cause. His diplomacy succeeded. In 1778, France officially entered the war as an ally of the United States. French soldiers, warships, money, and military supplies transformed the balance of power. For the first time, Britain faced a global conflict. 3 years later, in 1781, the decisive campaign unfolded at Yorktown, Virginia. American and French forces surrounded General Charles Cornwallis and his British army. Powerful French warships blocked every escape by sea. American artillery bombarded British defenses day and night. After weeks of relentless fighting, Cornwallis could no longer continue. On October 19, 1781, British troops marched out of Yorktown and laid down their weapons. The surrender shocked the world. After 6 long years of war, Britain's hopes of defeating the revolution had collapsed. Although negotiations continued for nearly 2 more years, the fighting was effectively over. In 1783, representatives from Britain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris. Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States of America. The impossible had become reality. A small collection of colonies had defeated the most powerful empire in the world. Soon afterward, George Washington gathered his officers for one final farewell. Instead of seizing power, he resigned his military command and returned home to Mount Vernon. His decision established a principle that would shape the future of the nation. In America, the military would always remain under civilian leadership. The revolution had ended, but the story of the United States was only beginning. From 13 determined colonies emerged a nation founded on the ideals of liberty, self-government, and the belief that ordinary people could shape their own future. Nearly 2.5 centuries later, the echoes of that struggle can still be heard across the United States. The sacrifices made by farmers, merchants, soldiers, and leaders during the American Revolution continue to influence democracy around the world. History remembers their victory not simply because they won a war, but because they proved that the dream of freedom could change the course of human history forever.